Wonderful song there, Nigeria will be great again. We are all very hopeful, very optimistic. But I know that sometimes you can begin to have second thoughts about that hope, and that optimism disappears. But hope is what keeps us alive. We all believe that Nigeria has potential and Nigeria shall rise again.
You know, this kind of song, we've heard over the years. I remember, you would of course remember, also Venom Mario's song.
Yes.
Nigeria Go Survive. I think it was in 1986, Ebenezer Obey did a song after Nigeria won the debut Golden Eaglets World Cup. He sang, Nigeria is still going to be sweet. Lagwaja also sang a song, I think about early 2000s or late 90s, Nigeria Go Sweet Again. So the optimism is there. And the confidence, the hope, the aspiration is there. How? I think that's the question.
Well, talking about the how, I suppose President Tinubu is telling us, and he has not stopped telling us, that this is the beginning of a new Nigeria, that this is the dawn of a new Nigeria, and everything he's doing, even though it may cause us some pain now, will bring us greatness in the future. So we should all look to the future. And one of these things is the budget, the budget proposal, I apologize, which he presented to a joint session of the National Assembly in Abuja on Wednesday. And this budget of renewed hope, as he dubbed it, is of 27.5 trillion naira. In this, his first budget since becoming president, he told the federal lawmakers that the revised 2024 to 2026 medium-term expenditure framework, MTEF, and fiscal strategy paper, FSP, set out the parameters for this budget. He also promised that efforts would be made to contain financial leakages through the effective implementation of key public financial reforms. So let us get some experts this morning to help us examine this budget. Is this really a budget that is taking us somewhere? And if it is, where exactly do these analysts think it is going to take us? One of those analysts is with us here in the studio, and he is Mr. Wole Ogundare, business advisory consultant.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me.
And the other is the managing director of Cowrie Asset Management, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, who joins us virtually. Good morning, Mr. Chukwu.
Thank you for having me. Merry Christmas.
Oh, okay. Christmas has come early. Merry Christmas, Mr. Chukwu. Thank you for joining us. Let me start with Mr. Ogundare, who's right here in the studio with us. 27.5 trillion and all the other details that come along.
Correct.
My immediate question is this a realistic budget for Nigeria at this point in time?
Thank you. You see, whenever I hear budgets, I'm an accountant. Budgets are just numbers to us. I usually like to look at the assumptions behind the budget. That's where you get a bit more.
Dollar at 775.
Thereabout.
What are the other assumptions?
Okay,
oil production.
Oil production. 1.78 thereabout.
1.78.
Inflation 21.4. What else is there? A few other assumptions. But you mentioned the medium-term expenditure framework. That is exactly what sits behind our budget. So if you want to discuss the budget, talk about the medium-term expenditure framework, because it has set up what you call the resource allocation as well as the policy document behind the budget. It is also what makes the budget transparent. So let me talk about the medium-term expenditure framework. You'll understand how our budgets are created now, and if it is indeed a budget of hope. 5 things sit behind the medium-term expenditure framework. The first one is the macroeconomic framework itself, which seems to look at all of the growth indicators. Then I think you mentioned that the president also mentioned the fiscal strategy paper. So everything fiscal, tax, infrastructure development sits there. The third one is the income and expenditure framework. So you mentioned that we have 27.5 trillion budget. Income is about 18 trillion. That sits there. Then the additional two, those first three are very important. The additional two looks at our debt. One looks at the current debt statement, and the other looks at the existing debt statement as well as the current plus existing. So, there's some debt now that we're going to take about 8-9 trillion, and there's an existing debt, circa about 88-90 trillion, which already exists. Now, those five
The way
things,
you accountants call this figure, sometimes us mere mortals get really scared.
Well,
When you think about the number of zeros behind it, 1 trillion, and then you're saying 80 trillion.
Yeah. Which is why he said to them, budget is just a number.
The budgets are numbers.
I'm having a fit.
Which is why I said, let's look at the assumptions behind it. When you look at these assumptions, the first thing I typically look at is the growth rate. So the macroeconomic framework tends to force you to look at the growth rate. What growth rate have they sort of put in the MTEF that the president projected? 3.76. Now, if you look at that growth rate, how does it really make sense? You compare it to the population growth rate in Nigeria. Our population growth rate today is about 2.5. So if you look at a 2.5 population growth rate relative to a 3.76 growth GDP, it tells you immediately that this is not a budget of hope. It is a budget of coasting along. Let us just coast along for now. Any budget of hope will be something where the growth rate is around 7 to 10%. So I guess the guys in charge, they're being very careful, not to overestimate their positions, which is why they've said, look, let us just coast along. So anything around hope, forget it. Nigerians should just forget it for now. There's nothing hopeful around it.
Oh dear.
This is not the budget, for me, that will reduce the Japa syndrome. It is not the budget that will also create some huge industrialization or some human capital, massive development, or a budget that will encourage employment and all of those things. No. Okay. This is just, let's just coast along for now.
Okay.
And all of the indicators seem to speak to this.
Let me ask, before I, follow up with Dr. Chukwu on this particular issue. Let me ask you first of all, and this is something that bothered me for a while. Every government comes on, you still answer, Alero's question about what your thoughts are on this budget. But before we go there, I want to ask you this. Every budget cycle, one of the questions that comes to my mind, maybe it's a little too simplistic. How can I give you more money when you haven't duly, adequately, and persuasively justified how you collected, how you dispensed the first one? So do you see that as an issue, that we don't have a good enough understanding of how the previous budget was spent, or we now have to, as Mr. Gundari said, coast along with another budget?
Is that question for me?
Yes, it is.
Okay. We have to recognize that the Minister of Budget and National Planning actually came out with a breakdown of the performance of 2023 budget up to September ended. If you look at that budget performance so far, it was reported by the minister that the total government revenue for the first 9 months of the year was 8.6 trillion. Of course, government spent about 11.4 trillion in the first 9 months of the year. And remember that government had projected to spend about 24 trillion naira for the entire year. But at the end of the first 9 months, they had only spent barely less than half of what we had projected, principally because the revenues were not realized. So two things you have to look at when you talk of implementation of previous year's budget. is that why was the budget not fully implemented? Because the revenue estimation of the government was overly optimistic. So if you fail to achieve your earnings, then it becomes impossible for you to achieve your expenditure. And what we have dealt with, which is why it looks like we don't get the impact of budgetary implementation or execution, is that government had focused on what we call non-discretionary expenses. Those are expenses related to payment of salaries and wages, meeting the overhead of the government, the living style and living standard of those in public service have been the priorities of government, while as the rest of the money goes to fund debt service. And if you even look at this year's budget, because we, unfortunately, I'm happy with what my colleague there said, we are basically replicating what we've had in the previous years. This year's budget, the government had made provision of total expenditure of 27.5 trillion, and on assumption that it will generate 18.2 trillion. But last year, based on what the Minister of Budget said, the first 9 months of the year, we only generated 8.6 trillion. If you take that 8.6 trillion that generated in 9 months, the run rate simply on average, we are generating about 950 billion every month. Yes, what that means that at the end of this year, we will at best generate 11.5 trillion. So if you have known that you can at best generate 11.5 trillion this year, why are you budgeting to generate 18.2 trillion? So obviously you have made an estimate that is not realistic. So if you make an estimate that is not realistic, knowing fully well that you are going to spend 8.25 trillion naira to pay debt, you spend another 9.92 trillion naira on your overhead, salaries and wages and running expenses and traveling around the world. So you are going to spend without spending 1 kobo on infrastructure. You're going to spend about 18.17 trillion naira on recurrent expenditure and debt service. And you have budgeted, you will generate 18.2 trillion. So if you fail to do that, you have to start borrowing to meet those compulsory payments. That leaves no room for capital expenditure. In fact, if you look at this year, capital expenditure, next year budget, capital expenditure provision is 8.7 trillion naira. The government intends to borrow. The budget is about 9.18 trillion naira. So every kobo that will be spent on infrastructure will be borrowed. So if government is unable to borrow, then it will not spend on infrastructure. And that's why we're not getting the impact. That's why we're running a cycle over the past few years, because you're not seeing the impact of budgetary allocation and budgetary expenditure on the life of Nigerians. The critical investments are not being made.
But do you see those figures coming down, those recurrent expenditure figures? Do you see them coming down in any way, manner, shape, or form? Because already from what you're saying now, it's like, I'm very poor with maths, but it sounds like a little more than 50% of the budget that is going into this recurrent expenditure.
Correct.
Yes, 9.92 billion on 18.2 trillion is more than 50% of total revenue. And if you look at the expenditure, it's in the region of 45% of the total expenditure. But the key thing is that we should not expect the recurrent expenditure to go down. We should actually expect it to go further up. When the government is planning in the budget that was recently passed, the supplementary budget, government is going to spend on additional vehicles. Government is going to spend on presidential fleet. What that means, these are items of consumption that has an operating cost element built into it. If you buy 5 vehicles, additional 5 vehicles, you're going to buy fuel for those vehicles, you're going to maintain those vehicles, you're going to pay for drivers for those vehicles.
Yes.
And so what we're doing here, we're further building the base on which recurrent expenditure is spent on. Because when you keep building on this, you are going to add more. We have not seen any strategic initiative that will bring down recurrent expenditure, such as rationalization of the public service. That has been mounted for the past 24 years. It's not been implemented. Rather, we are seeing creation of additional ministries, agencies, and departments as ways of creating jobs for the boys. So we should expect, which is what we have seen in the past 8 years or 10 years. We've seen consistent increase in the recurrent expenditure of government because the structure on which you incur recurrent expenditure is being expanded.
Well, Mr. Ogunari, one of the issues or defense, so to speak, for want of a better word, put up by government at some point when that argument came that creating more ministries or departments or agencies of government is expanding the expenditure net, so to speak, further. But the justification, well, maybe an argument, not justification, an argument that was put forward was, look, it's better to have a more detailed system that is more productive than have few that are not productive. What do you think that's a fair argument?
No, it's not, because what I would do is I would challenge the productivity of those MDAs. What is their productivity? Again, let's look at the budget. Your productivity must speak to that budget. Our budget today, total productivity, is around 33 to 35 billion US dollars. We have a population of 200 million, 210 million people. South Africa's population, I like comparative analysis a lot. South Africa's population is about 59, 60 million people. The budget is 4 times ours. The budget is about 192, 93 billion US dollars. Now, if you want to talk about productivity, I would imagine that what you're trying to do is expand that 33 to 35 billion US dollars, expand it further with the creation of new ministries, which is what my colleague, the doctor, just said that, look, how is it going to happen? If, for instance, we're saying those ministries, for instance, they're going to give us an additional 50 billion US dollars in addition to what we currently have. Hoorah! Who's going to say no? We're all going to, I'm going to be here smiling and jumping and, saying, this is the budget.
Leading me to this question, Mr. Mudari. The blue economy, I've seen figures about how the potential of that industry in hundreds of, is it millions or billions of dollars?
Billions of dollars.
And in Nigeria, the potential no less.
Correct.
The solid minerals sector, Mr. Alake put the viability at something in the region, is it 700 million or $700 billion as well? The agricultural, the livestock sector of Nigeria's agricultural industry, as I'd say 3-4 years ago or more, was put at something in the region of $31 trillion. That's from the office, no, it's trillion naira. That's from the office of the Vice President and or the Federal Ministry of Agriculture. Now, these haven't significantly opened up.
Correct.
What would you say are the challenges? Let's talk about, we can say the solid minerals, the blue economy is new. But the solid minerals has always been there.
Great.
The agricultural sector has always been there.
Yeah.
In fact, that was the cash cow, so to speak, in the First Republic. So what's our challenge with those?
Now, let me tell you what the challenge is. There's an infrastructure master plan. There's a national infrastructure master plan. It was updated in 2022. If you look at that document and compare Nigeria's infrastructure stock, which means our total infrastructure, which is how we're going to convert these possibilities into money. Our current infrastructure stock as a function of GDP today is around 30%. It is extremely low. I've said this in so many places. As long as your total infrastructure stock to your GDP is low, there is no way you can generate money. It can't happen. All of the countries that are very productive have very high infrastructure stock. China is even too far, but China is in the 90s in terms of percentage.
That's talking about capital expenditure.
That's talking about capital expenditure. So you have to find a way to improve your infrastructure stock to GDP ratio, in a modular manner, which is again what my colleague mentioned to say, look, over the years, the implementation of our capital expenditure within the budget has been somewhere around 40%. Extremely poor. Therefore, how are you able to translate the possibilities? Let me give you an example. I have a client, in the plastic manufacturing sector, who says today, his cost of sales, 60% of it is power, as an example. And he was saying that, look, if he had a way to reduce that to about 30%, he will hire more, he will produce more, he will pay more taxes, etc. You see where I'm going with this? Therefore, as long as that infrastructure stock remains poor, and Nigerians must understand this, It's the aggregate value of our total infrastructure: road, rail, power, health infrastructure, security infrastructure, agri infrastructure, transport infrastructure. All of those things put together is currently poor. And you see, I always like to look at Nigeria as 6 countries in one. I always don't like, because each region has grown in a sort of different pace. Therefore, as a government, and coming back to MTEF, which helps you look at your fiscal strategy paper, that fiscal strategy paper is not just tax. I hear a lot of tax, expand tax next. There's infrastructure in there. Somebody should be saying, according to all the 6 geozones, this is how we want to grow each geozone based on the, sort of innate requirements.
Maybe they themselves should come up with some kind of proposal. Because, shouldn't they also... Anyway, that's not for today.
Okay. Dr. Chukwu, from the calculations which Mr. Ogundare made, or from the facts that we have from the budget proposal, the budget deficit comes to about 9 trillion. We don't even know how we are going to fund the budget itself. And then there is a 9 trillion naira deficit. Please explain to us the meaning of that in layman's terms so that we can understand clearly. We haven't even found money to do the main job. We have added things that amount to 9 trillion, which we have to also find money to take care of.
Okay, thank you, Alero. Let me use myself as an example to bring it closer home to people. It then means that, for instance, I'm saying that my total annual income, my total salaries amounts to something like 200,000, and that I have a plan to spend something in the region of 300,000. I'm going to spend 300,000. So I'm already owing debt. I'm already owing debt worth about 1 million. So I need to pay interest on that debt. So I need to go borrow another 100,000. So the question becomes, where do I get this 100,000? Who will lend to me? What the government has done is that they have made a provision of total expenditure of 27.5 trillion and 18.2 trillion as income. And therefore, that leaves a gap of about 9.18 trillion naira. They have said to us that they will borrow about 7.8 trillion from multiple sources, local market, foreign international bond market. And then they will also receive about 263 or 283 billion naira from privatization. That we have had in the budget for years, and I don't know what they will privatize the next 12 months that they get 280 or 260 billion. So that's also something in the air. And then they say they have about 1 trillion naira lending, multilateral lending, the likes of African Development Bank, World Bank, the monies that they are committed to lend to Nigeria, that they withdraw on it. That means they will borrow about 1 trillion from that source of people who are supporting some specific developmental initiative. Take, for instance, the malaria eradication initiative, tuberculosis eradication initiative. Some of these initiatives that you have World Bank supporting, that they will draw that 1 trillion. Okay. Even that 1 trillion, we start to pay back in future because it's not grant. If it's grant, it's a gift. But as long as it's loan, even if it comes at a minimal interest rate, it will be paid back at some point. It could be 20 with 30 years, but it builds into our debt profile. So we are back to a situation where we are going to borrow and borrow and borrow, and most importantly, we are projected to borrow 9.18 trillion, because when you ignore when you compartmentalize them and say this is 7.8, the other one is 1, you forget that they are effectively borrowing about 9.18 trillion. When you borrow that, you are going to add up to your current debt profile. You are going to pay interest on that. So your interest service will be higher than what it is now. And that's where we are. So we are digging a hole. And like they said, look, one of the commonsensical statements is people say that when you're in a hole, stop digging. But we're in a hole, we're digging further, and we're hoping that one miracle has happened. And then we'll come up and start flying in the air. We're getting deeper into the ditch. And we just need to find, and I have advocated repeatedly, including in your station, that we have to involve a funding mechanism where the government can fund capital projects, not from budgetary allocation, because we're not going to have the revenue profile in the next 10 years to build infrastructure that will make us commercially competitive. I mean, my colleague in the studio has said clearly that if you compare our capital goods stock to any other country in the world that is developing, we're not anywhere close to it. So we need to do that. So we're not going to the allocation.
Dr. Chukwu, but we are already owing so much. I think about 81 trillion or something that we owe already.
Yes, and that's why I said we're in a hole and we're digging further. The government had just applied for National Assembly to approve about $7.8 billion of borrowing and 100 million euro. I'm sure you remember that. And that's still in the works. I don't know whether they have approved that. They said the previous government had consented to that. And I wouldn't know. If the federal government adopted that is wrong, why do you want to continue on it? But beyond that, apart from that, we want to borrow now 9.18 trillion. So all these things will max up our debt. And then we're going to get to a point where it will be difficult for us to stabilize it. Before you, then let me just mention this. If you look at this year's budget, you have provision of debt service of 8.25 trillion. I had mentioned earlier that at the end of the first 9 months of this year, we've only earned 8.6 trillion. You want to service debt next year by 8.25 trillion. So your debt service to actual revenue will be in the region of 90% at the end of this year.
Okay, we are totally out of time, but gentlemen, you have to address this one in 30 seconds both ways.
Each.
Let me start with you, Dr. Chukwu. One of the arguments that the federal government has put forward is that this draft budget has been prepared against the backdrop of continuing global and domestic changes. How challenging is that for you in the light of our realities?
Well, I think beyond the global changes, the most important, you have to look at what are my own internal potentials. You can't build a budget based on what is happening globally. You have to look at what are my own potentials. The core of a budget is based on assumption of what are your potential, what are your capabilities. If you look at the global global environment, the oil sector, OPEC just reduced crude production, and there's already some dissenting voices on reduction of crude production. You could see next year that OPEC will not be able to put together the OPEC Plus alliance. So that means crude price could actually drop below the $7.96 dollars they have projected, and that could throw entire projections of revenue into this area.
Okay. Well, Mr. Mundari.
Yeah, for me, two things. One, if you look at the oil sector, which is where I think we can generate a lot of funds internally, I'll also look inwards. Two things: vandalism, theft. Find a way to eradicate it. Those two things, do it first. And then the next thing, we'll be looking at the body language that we're exhibiting. You can't be buying 160 million Jeeps. It sends the wrong body language altogether to the global community. Those will be the two things. So I will look inwards and say, look, how do we reduce all of the spending? And then, you know, a lot of people have talked about your on-site report as well that wants to streamline internal expenditure. How can we implement some of that report, if not all?
Forget sending a wrong message to the international community. You're sending a wrong message even to your own people, whom you are asking to tighten their belts all the time.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wale Ogundare, business advisory consultant, who joined us in our studio in Lagos, and Dr. Johnson Chukwu, MD, Cowrie Asset Management Limited, who joined us virtually. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Sunrise will be right back in a moment to look at another interesting conversation. Please join us.